Imagine a war, right? A war that stretched for 13 years. It actually became the longest in U.S. history. And as our sources really powerfully suggest, it ultimately left a country in a state that was, well, eerily similar to when the conflict first began. That's the complex, often perplexing, and deeply impactful story we're diving into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a pretty extensive exploration of the Afghanistan War. We're specifically focusing on the period from 2001 to 2014. And this deep dive, it isn't just about, listing dates and battles. It's really about understanding the fundamental questions that shape this huge international conflict. We'll trace its very origins, looking at how it started and the long shadow that came before it. Then we'll dissect how shifting U.S. and international strategies really influenced the war's progression, moving beyond those initial military goals to ambitious nation building. Along the way, we'll pinpoint the key internal and external challenges, the things that consistently hindered efforts and complicated, well, pretty much every step. And finally, we'll grapple with the long-term consequences, the lasting impacts, before looking at how this significant chapter ultimately concluded. Our mission, really, is to navigate a stack of detailed accounts drawing primarily from a really comprehensive narrative titled The Afghanistan War 2001-2014 and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and surprising insights for you, our curious listener.
Yeah, and what's truly illuminating here, I think, is recognizing how the entire narrative unfolds in these distinct but very interconnected phases. Each phase, you see, presented its own unique set of challenges, its own implications. And that offers us a critical lens, not just on international engagement in Afghanistan, but really on the enduring complexities inherent in modern conflict itself. Understanding these phases is, well, it's crucial to grasping how those initial objectives transformed, how the progression of the war was fundamentally influenced by evolving strategies, and how these persistent internal and external challenges constantly reshaped its trajectory. It wasn't static at all.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on the war post 9/11, you kind of have to look back, right?
Way back.
Yeah, way back. Understand the historical crucible that forged the landscape it all happened on. Our sources actually call it the long shadow,
A fitting name.
which means, we need to rewind. Back to 1979, that's, well, long before the Twin Towers fell.
Indeed. The U.S. and British invasion in late 2001, it wasn't Afghanistan's first experience with external intervention or, prolonged conflict. Not by a long shot. It was preceded by over 2 decades of really intense warfare. So the crucial starting point for understanding all this lies with the Soviet invasion. December 24th, 1979. Soviet tanks didn't just cross the Amu Darya River. They rolled in with a clear stated purpose. Ostensibly, anyway.
Ostensibly.
Yeah, ostensibly to restore stability following a coup. A coup that brought these Marxist-Leninist groups, specifically the People's Party, the Khalq, and the Banner Party, Parcham, to power. These were factions with distinct ideological leanings vying for control, and their internal struggles created an opening that Moscow felt, well, compelled to exploit.
Okay, so the Soviets come in to stabilize things after this internal communist coup. But that Soviet presence, that foreign military footprint, it immediately triggered a huge reaction, didn't it?
Oh, immediately. A widespread, passionate, nationwide rebellion. This wasn't something the Afghan people just quietly accepted.
No.
No, it ignited a powerful and, importantly, decentralized resistance movement right from day one.
And this resistance, who were they?
Well, this resistance wasn't some, loosely organized militia at first. It coalesced around fighters who became globally recognized as the Mujahideen. Their inspiration, their unifying force, was deeply rooted in Islam. But what's fascinating here, and often kind of overlooked in the broader story, is the extensive covert backing they received.
Right, this wasn't just a local fight.
Not at all. It was a proxy war, really, on a global stage. The Mujahideen received significant support from Pakistan, which was a critical staging ground, obviously. Support came from Saudi Arabia, a financial powerhouse, and perhaps most controversially, given what happened later, from the United States.
Wow, so the U.S. was backing these Islamic fighters against the Soviets.
Heavily. This geopolitical chessboard meant these local fighters were equipped and enabled by major international powers. And that dynamic, well, it would have profound and unforeseen consequences down the road.
And it was within this crucible of externally supported guerrilla warfare that a new, pretty ominous force began to take shape, didn't it? Something that would dramatically alter the global security landscape.
That's right. Our sources note that foreign volunteers, people drawn by the anti-Soviet cause, the call of jihad, they joined the Mujahideen. And these foreign fighters, they soon recognized the need for a more coordinated approach to their efforts against the Soviets. They needed structure.
Okay.
And this network they formed, this coordinating body, would eventually become known as Al-Qaeda.
So the very fight against the Soviets, which the U.S. supported, inadvertently created the fertile ground for Al-Qaeda,
Right.
a future, far more dangerous enemy.
An enemy that would eventually turn its sights on its former patrons. It's a crucial and deeply ironic connection. This protracted guerrilla war, fueled by external support and internal fervor, it finally led to the Soviet departure in 1989.
After a decade of fighting.
A decade of brutal fighting, yeah. Soviet forces withdrew, having suffered significant casualties, huge financial strain. It was their Vietnam, essentially. However, the Soviets' absence, while a victory for the Mujahideen, it didn't usher in peace and stability for Afghanistan. Not even close.
No, quite the opposite, right.
If anything, it created a power vacuum that quickly devolved into another chapter of intense suffering.
Far from peace. What followed was just intense and devastating chaos, a brutal civil war that pitted former allies against each other.
Yeah.
The Mujahideen, even though they'd won against the Soviets together, they were deeply politically fragmented.
Yeah.
Our sources describe this descent into armed conflict among these very factions by 1994. They just couldn't form a cohesive, stable government, which led to widespread insecurity and, an urgent yearning among the people for order, almost any order.
Exactly. And it was out of this violent internal strife, this power vacuum, that a new radical force began to gain traction and eventually emerged, the Taliban.
And their rise was incredibly fast.
Shockingly swift, yeah. Fueled by a promise of stability, a return to what they considered Islamic purity in a land just ravaged by lawlessness. The Taliban seized Kabul in 1996, and what they instituted was an ultra-conservative, incredibly rigid interpretation of Islamic law.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, draconian restrictions. Women were forbidden from education, denied employment, largely confined to their homes. Public life was heavily regulated. And they prescribed harsh, often public punishments, severing hands for theft, execution for what might seem like petty crimes elsewhere. It painted a stark picture of society under incredibly strict, unyielding rule, deeply at odds with, modern norms.
And that same year, 1996, something else happened, something that would directly lead to the events that brought Afghanistan into the global spotlight.
Right. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, having been expelled from Sudan due to international pressure.
He needed a new home base.
He did. And he found a welcoming sanctuary in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. He immediately established his organization's headquarters there, basically setting up shop under the Taliban's protection.
So it wasn't just letting him stay, it was protection.
Oh, absolutely. This was more than just a welcome. It solidified a critical strategic alliance. Our sources indicate that with al-Qaeda's financial backing, their tactical advice, maybe even fighters, the Taliban managed to expand their control significantly. They gained command of over 90% of Afghan territory by the summer of 2001.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah. This wasn't a casual relationship. It was a deeply integrated partnership. Al-Qaeda operated with near impunity, planning and training for future operations right under the Taliban's nose in a country they effectively controlled. This alliance made Afghanistan a breeding ground for global terrorism.
And as we get terrifyingly close to September 11th, there's a crucial pre-event detail, something often overlooked. The assassination of the famed Mujahideen leader Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Ah, yes. The Lion of Panjshir.
Exactly. Our source tells us al-Qaeda hitmen carried it out on September 9th, 2001, just 2 days before the World Trade Center attacks. Massoud was a formidable figure leading the Northern Alliance, a key anti-Taliban force. And he had unsuccessfully sought greater U.S. backing for his fight.
Right.
His elimination, orchestrated by al-Qaeda, it suggests a deliberate move, doesn't it? To consolidate the Taliban's power, remove a significant internal obstacle right before al-Qaeda launched its global strike.
It really does. It looks like clearing the path for their plans, ensuring no immediate reprisal from a unified Afghan opposition.
Strategic neutralization.
Absolutely. Removing a unifying figure who might have rallied significant internal resistance just as the world was about to be thrown into chaos. It meant that as the world reeled from 9/11, the internal Afghan opposition was already weakened, leaving the Taliban and al-Qaeda in a stronger, more unassailable position within the country.
So, with that long and brutal shadow cast by decades of conflict, the rise of extremist powers. Let's move to the direct trigger for the U.S. and international intervention, September 11th and its immediate aftermath. The hijacking and crashing of 4 U.S. jetliners on September 11, 2001, World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and that field in Pennsylvania. It brought instant, unprecedented global attention to Afghanistan.
Understandably.
The plot, meticulously hatched by al-Qaeda, and our sources confirm some of the 19 hijackers had actually trained in Afghanistan deep within that sanctuary provided by the Taliban.
Yeah, this act was the unequivocal, the direct trigger for the U.S. and British invasion.
Yeah.
The sheer scale, the audacity of the attacks made an immediate, forceful response essentially inevitable. The Bush administration, reeling from the devastation, quickly coalesced around a clear, two-pronged strategy.
Truth was,
First, oust the Taliban from their control of Afghanistan. Second, dismantle al-Qaeda's operational capabilities and leadership wherever they existed. That was the initial scope, the ambition.
and President George W. Bush made his demands very clear, didn't he? To the Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar.
Unequivocally clear. The message was delivered. Deliver to U.S. authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land.
And Omar refused.
He did. Our source states explicitly that Omar's steadfast refusal to comply directly led to the implementation of war plans that were likely already being drawn up. There was no room for negotiation, no ambiguity. A refusal meant war, a direct consequence of the Taliban's unwavering protection of al-Qaeda.
So that refusal sealed their fate.
It highlights the direct causal link. The Taliban's choice to prioritize protecting al-Qaeda's leadership, their perceived allies, over avoiding a direct confrontation with, well, the world's sole superpower at the time, sealed their fate and immediately set the stage for Operation Enduring Freedom, a choice with immediate devastating repercussions for their regime.
Which brings us to that initial military response, Operation Enduring Freedom, the first phase of the war. Our sources say the campaign started somewhat covertly, September 26, 2001, with a small elite CIO team, codename Jawbreaker.
Right. Their initial mission was critical. Link up, work directly with existing anti-Taliban allies already on the ground.
Now, what's revealing here, according to our sources, is the strategic thinking right from the start.
There was nuance there. U.S. officials, particularly at the Pentagon, harbored deep concerns about getting drawn into a protracted, costly occupation, a Vietnam-style quagmire.
They didn't want another Vietnam.
No. And they explicitly sought to avoid the mistakes of the Soviet experience just 2 decades prior, which had drained the USSR's resources and ultimately failed. This informed their initial choice to deploy a light footprint, leveraging Afghan partners as the primary ground forces rather than committing a massive conventional military presence right away. The goal was empower local forces, not replace them.
So actively trying to avoid the Soviet quagmire. And they relied on who exactly?
Primarily the Northern Alliance. Despite the recent loss of Massoud, they'd quickly regrouped under commanders like Mohammad Fahim and Abdul Rashid Dostum. And they also teamed up with anti-Taliban Pashtuns in the south, including a relatively unknown tribal leader back then named Hamid Karzai. He'd become a central figure later, of course. These are the key allies, the local partners essential to the U.S. strategy.
Okay.
So the CIA team, Jawbreaker, was soon augmented by specialized U.S. and British Special Forces contingents. Together, they formed these crucial liaison units. They provided not just arms and equipment, but vital advice and, critically, coordinating targeting for the overwhelming air campaign.
Right, the air power was key.
Absolutely. This aerial bombardment, a very public display of force, began on October 7, 2001. That marked the formal, visible start of Operation Enduring Freedom. And the combination of precision air power with local ground forces proved incredibly effective very quickly.
And the military progress was, well, incredibly rapid, wasn't it? Far faster than many expected.
Far exceeding initial expectations, yeah. In late October, Northern Alliance forces began to swiftly overtake towns and cities formerly held by the Taliban, moving with surprising speed. Then, November 13, a really surprising detail. The Northern Alliance marched triumphantly into Kabul, the capital.
Even defying U.S. wishes.
Yeah, defying U.S. wishes for a more cautious approach. The Taliban, rather than engaging in a pitched battle for the capital, simply retreated, melted away without a fight.
Why do that? Why not fight for Kabul?
It seemed to be a tactical decision. Avoid direct, conventional battles they knew they couldn't win against that air power. Their rapid retreat from Kabul didn't signal their complete demise, but rather a strategic choice to preserve their forces, regroup, and fight another day, perhaps differently. It left a power vacuum, though, that quickly required a political solution, even as the military campaign continued elsewhere.
And the fall of overt Taliban power was cemented with Kandahar, right? Their spiritual home.
Exactly. Kandahar, the largest city in the south, the Taliban's spiritual heartland, finally fell on December 6. Our sources tell us it was besieged by forces led by Karzai and another Pashtun leader, Gul Agha Shirzai, both operating with substantial U.S. air support and advisory help. That really marked what appeared to be the official end of the Taliban's overt, organized rule in Afghanistan, at least for them.
So with this rapid military success, the focus immediately shifted to politics.
Immediately, establishing a new political order, anti-Taliban figures convened at a UN-sponsored conference in Bonn, Germany. It was there, with significant behind-the-scenes maneuvering, influence exerted by the United States, that Hamid Karzai was selected to lead the country on an interim basis.
Establishing the framework for a post-Taliban government.
Precisely, aiming to create a legitimate, internationally recognized government.
But despite the swift military victory and the political transition in Bonn, the core enemy remained elusive, didn't they? The leaders.
Very elusive. An intensive manhunt was immediately undertaken for the key figures: Mullah Omar, Osama bin Laden, and al-Qaeda's number 2, Ayman al-Zawahiri. And our sources point to a particularly controversial episode here. The December 2001 Battle of Tora Bora, bin Laden's mountain stronghold.
Controversial how?
Well, critics, even years later, would question why the U.S. military allowed Afghan forces to lead the final assault rather than taking a more direct, overwhelming role themselves with U.S. forces.
And bin Laden escaped.
The prevailing belief, supported by intelligence assessments, was that bin Laden, likely with critical assistance from some Afghan and Pakistani forces on the border, managed to slip across into Pakistan, evading what could have been his definitive capture right then and there.
Wow. So that raises a huge question, doesn't it?
A critical and enduring question that would reverberate for the next decade. Was the initial objective of dismantling al-Qaeda entirely met? Or was the pivot to other objectives in nation-building, stabilization too swift? Did it allow key leadership to escape and reconstitute?
And the consequences of that escape were
Profound. The failure to decisively capture or kill bin Laden and Mullah Omar at Tora Bora had huge implications. Al-Qaeda subsequently managed to reestablish its base of operations in Pakistan's tribal areas, transforming into a persistent cross-border threat. Similarly, Mullah Omar and top Taliban lieutenants settled in and around the Pakistani city of Quetta, maintaining a critical sanctuary from which they could regroup, reorganize, and eventually plan their insurgency.
So the threat wasn't neutralized, it just moved.
Exactly, and that fact would haunt all subsequent efforts in Afghanistan. It suggested that a perceived military victory could be dangerously premature if the underlying conditions for conflict, like these sanctuaries, were not fully addressed.
And despite the rapid initial success in ousting the Taliban regime, the formal announcement of an end to major combat actually came much later.
Much later. It signaled the shift in perceived priorities, perhaps. In March 2002, there was Operation Anaconda, U.S. and Afghan forces in a significant fight against some 800 entrenched al-Qaeda and Taliban militants, showed pockets of resistance remained.
And other countries joined in then too.
Yeah, Anaconda also marked the entrance of other countries' troops into the war in a bigger way. Special operations forces from Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway all participated, broadening the international commitment. But it wasn't until May 1st, 2003, over a year and a half after the invasion, that U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld publicly announced an end to major combat in Afghanistan.
And even then, there were still thousands of U.S. troops there.
Still 8,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan at that point, clearly indicating the conflict was far from over, merely transitioning into a new, perhaps more complex phase.
Okay, so if we unpack this initial phase, what are the key takeaways? Incredible speed of the initial military victory.
Definitely.
But also, critically, the immediate sowing of seeds for future challenges. The controversial escape of key figures like bin Laden. The enduring presence of a core enemy just across the border in Pakistan. And an early decision point, that light footprint, that would really shape the entire trajectory of the war.
Exactly. This period highlights that crucial strategic dilemma, the tension between achieving immediate military objectives and establishing conditions for long-term stability. The consequences of these early decisions, especially the failure to neutralize insurgent leadership and their cross-border sanctuaries, would indeed reverberate for years. It directly influenced the war's progression and made the subsequent nation-building efforts exponentially more difficult.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for what happened next. Moving into what we can call Phase 2, roughly 2002 to 2008. We see this significant shift in U.S. and international strategy, a pivot towards nation building, but one that was fraught with immediate and unforeseen challenges.
Yes, with the Taliban and al-Qaeda seemingly ousted from overt control, the international focus understandably shifted. It pivoted dramatically towards reconstruction and nation building in Afghanistan. In April 2002, President Bush publicly announced what he called a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, promising substantial financial assistance to rebuild the war-torn nation.
A big promise, a Marshall Plan.
A very big promise. However, what's truly crucial here, and a point that would haunt the entire nation-building endeavor, is that from the very outset, development efforts in Afghanistan were demonstrably, consistently, inadequately funded.
So the money wasn't really there?
The grand promise simply didn't translate into sufficient resources on the ground. The ambition outstripped the investment.
And why was that? Why the underfunding? Our sources point directly to the Iraq factor as a major culprit.
Absolutely. Attention among U.S. officials rapidly and overwhelmingly turned to the looming confrontation in Iraq. This wasn't just a distraction. It was a profound diversion of resources, strategic attention, military assets.
How much are we talking?
Between 2001 and 2009, just over $38 billion in U.S. aid was appropriated for Afghanistan, which sounds like a lot, but more than half of it was allocated just to training Afghan security forces, leaving a mere fraction and insufficient amount for actual development. Things like schools, healthcare, agriculture, infrastructure.
And experts felt this wasn't enough.
Woefully inadequate. Experts deemed this a fraction of the amount required for the comprehensive development Afghanistan desperately needed, especially after decades of conflict.
So this resource diversion, the underfunding, created a lasting deficit.
A significant and lasting deficit that crippled the nation-building efforts. And furthermore, the aid program itself was plagued by systemic issues.
Like what?
Widespread waste, significant confusion over whether civilian or military authorities were ultimately responsible for leading essential development projects. Education, health, agriculture, who was in charge.
So internal disarray, too.
Yeah, this lack of coherent coordination further hampered the effectiveness of the limited aid that was provided. It diluted its impact, fostered inefficiency.
And then there were the limitations of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, the force meant to provide security.
Right. Our sources reveal the U.S. initially argued vehemently against allowing ISAF to deploy beyond the immediate Kabul area.
Why? Why keep them penned in?
The Pentagon insisted on that light footprint, primarily because officials were deeply concerned Afghanistan would become a drag on U.S. resources, especially as their strategic attention and military assets were increasingly shifting towards the impending war in Iraq.
So Iraq again. Limiting ISAF's reach because of Iraq.
And that decision had profound consequences on the ground. When ISAF finally did venture beyond Kabul, its efforts were consistently hampered by caveats.
Caveats? What are those?
Strict, often prohibitive, restrictions imposed by the individual countries contributing troops. These caveats limited active engagement against the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
How?
Preventing forces from operating in certain areas or at certain times or engaging in specific types of combat. We can't do night patrols or we can only operate in this province. NATO oversaw ISAF, its first mission outside Europe, a big deal for them. But the force was often hamstrung by a persistent lack of troops as international commitments flagged.
And not all countries were willing to fight.
Many nations, reluctant to expose their forces to heavy combat, focused their deployments in safer, less insurgent-heavy regions. This created significant operational gaps that insurgents absolutely exploited.
And the U.S. bore the brunt of the fighting.
The U.S. remained the largest foreign force throughout this period and consequently bore the heaviest losses. By spring 2010, over 1,000 U.S. troops had been killed. Alongside significant British and Canadian casualties, more than 20 other countries lost troops too. But this disproportionate burden for the combat-ready forces, while others operated under restrictive caveats, further impacted the overall effectiveness and, frankly, the unity of the international effort.
And this connects to public opinion back home, doesn't it?
Critically. As the fighting dragged on, casualties escalated, the war inevitably lost popularity in many Western countries. This domestic political pressure meant governments faced increasing calls to keep troops out of harm's way or to pull them out altogether. And that had a direct, profound impact on commitment levels, troop numbers, operational flexibility on the ground, a real strategic tension between political will at home and military necessity in Afghanistan.
Okay, so lots of challenges on the security and funding side. But there were some positive developments, right? Democratic hopes.
Yes, despite these operational and funding challenges, there were significant democratic hopes and milestones achieved during this period. The first democratic Afghan elections since the fall of the Taliban were held in October 2004. Impressive 80% voter turnout, gave Hamid Karzai a 5-year term as president.
And parliament.
Parliamentary elections followed in 2005 with important provisions for women who secured reserved seats in the new legislature. These were vital steps toward building a representative government, visible signs of progress.
But even the structure of that government had issues.
It did. The 2004 Constitution itself, while democratic in principle, presented a fundamental structural challenge. It provided for a powerfully centralized government with weak regional authorities.
And that's not how Afghanistan traditionally worked.
No, it was in direct opposition to Afghanistan's long-standing traditions of decentralized power, strong tribal structures, local autonomy. This inherent structural contradiction created a persistent source of internal instability, fostered resentment, and hindered effective governance at the local level.
And President Karzai himself, despite having these vast constitutional powers.
He was widely regarded as a weak and increasingly isolated leader. Our sources note he grew largely confined to the presidential palace in Kabul. Constant security concerns, multiple assassination attempts, limited his ability to govern effectively or connect with the populace.
And corruption was a huge problem.
His government was, regrettably, deeply beset by widespread corruption, eroding public trust, diverting vital resources, a major issue.
And the Afghan army and police, the ones meant to take over.
Those foundational efforts to build a national army and police force, crucial for long-term security, were troubled from the very start. They suffered from inadequate international support, inconsistent training, and were further complicated by deep-seated ethnic differences, loyalties among Afghans, made it incredibly difficult to forge a truly national, unified fighting force.
So a fundamental weakness there, too.
A persistent and ultimately critical problem in governance and security forces, directly impacting the war's progression and Afghanistan's ability to stand on its own.
So, stepping back and looking at this phase, 2002-2008, what does it all mean for understanding the war's progression? We had these grand plans for nation building, this vision for a stable, democratic Afghanistan. But the reality was far more complex, critically under-resourced, largely because Iraq was demanding attention, diverting focus, money, troops. It created a void.
Yeah, if you connect this to the bigger picture, that shift in focus and resources to Iraq created a vacuum and a resource deficit in Afghanistan. And that allowed fundamental internal challenges, weak governance, corruption, slow security force development to fester and grow. This directly influenced the war's progression. It set the stage for the Taliban's powerful resurgence and made the international community's task immensely more difficult than it already was. It really demonstrated how external priorities could inadvertently undermine ambitious long-term goals right next door.
And that resurgence is exactly what happened next, isn't it? This leads us into a period of rising violence, the Taliban adopting new, much more lethal tactics starting around 2005.
Indeed. The Taliban, having retreated and regrouped in their sanctuaries, decisively reasserted their presence. And crucially, they adopted new, highly effective tactics modeled on those being used by insurgents in Iraq. This signaled a profound adaptation on their part, a learning enemy.
What kind of tactics?
They moved away from open conventional combat, which had largely failed them against superior international firepower, to a far more insidious and devastating form of warfare. Suicide bombings and improvised explosive devices, IEDs. These began to cause heavy, demoralizing casualties among both international forces and, tragically, Afghan civilians. This is a significant and deadly strategic shift.
And the numbers really show this shift, don't they?
They underscore the dramatic impact. Between January 2005 and August 2006, Afghanistan endured a staggering 64 suicide attacks, a tactic virtually unknown there before. At first, maybe fewer casualties, but as the Taliban got better training more powerful explosives, the death toll climbed dramatically.
Horrific examples come to mind.
Our sources mention specific ones. Over 70 people, many children, killed in a suicide attack in Baghlan in November 2007. And in 2008, more than 50 people lost their lives at the Indian embassy in Kabul, another devastating suicide bombing. These attacks brought a new, chilling level of terror and unpredictability to daily life.
A critical and deadly adaptation by the insurgency. Harder to counter.
Much harder with conventional military force. And disturbingly, the Taliban's resurgence correlated directly with a noticeable rise in anti-American and anti-Western sentiment among the Afghan populace.
Why? What fueled that?
Our sources point to several factors eroding trust, fostering resentment. First, the frustratingly sluggish pace of reconstruction. Lots of promises, little visible change for many. Second, widespread allegations of prisoner abuse at U.S. detention facilities like Bagram. Deeply offensive, fueled anti-foreign narratives. Third, the pervasive, unchecked corruption within the Afghan government itself, which international forces were seen as propping up.
And civilian casualties.
Finally, and perhaps most devastatingly, the tragic civilian casualties caused by U.S. and NATO bombings, often resulting from airstrikes targeting insurgents but hitting civilians too. These grievances were profound, cumulative.
There was that riot in Kabul.
A stark example. May 2006, a U.S. military vehicle crash sparked violent anti-American riots in Kabul, the worst the capital had seen since the war began. Clearly showed the depth of public anger.
So even well-intentioned actions or unintended consequences were eroding trust, turning public opinion against international forces. Meanwhile, as things deteriorated, NATO took on a larger role.
Later in 2006, NATO formally took command of the war across the entire country, a major escalation for the alliance. But simultaneously, American officials indicated a reduced U.S. combat role, a decision heavily influenced by the escalating sectarian warfare and resource demands back in Iraq.
Iraq's shadow again.
Constantly, further illustrating its persistent detrimental impact on Afghanistan's trajectory. And critically, while the international community struggled with a coherent strategy, the Taliban escalated its campaign on multiple fronts. Intensified fundraising, securing significant financial support from wealthy individuals, groups in the Persian Gulf. But perhaps most significantly, they directly benefited from Afghanistan's resurgent opium industry, a massive, largely untraceable source of revenue.
The opium problem, just huge.
Absolutely massive, a truly insidious, persistent challenge. Our source notes that after the Taliban's initial removal in 2001, they had actually suppressed poppy cultivation. The industry made a dramatic comeback. Within a few years, Afghanistan was supplying over 90% of the world's opium, despite various Western-backed eradication campaigns.
And that funded the insurgency.
It provided a consistent, massive, largely self-sustaining financial lifeline, allowed them to fund operations, pay fighters, acquire weapons, effectively insulated them from international financial pressure.
A crucial strategic failure then, not tackling that effectively.
It highlights how the enemy adapted faster, leveraged existing local conditions, illicit economies more effectively than international forces could counter. The Taliban's ability to fund itself outside direct international control, combined with those sanctuaries across the border, it was a persistent, deeply problematic strategic challenge, directly influenced the war's progression, the insurgency's resilience.
And speaking of persistent challenges, what about targeting the Taliban leadership during this time?
Very limited success. The U.S. struggled to kill or capture top commanders. Our sources mention a few exceptions. Mullah Obadullah Akhund, captured in Pakistan in early 2007. Mullah Dadullah, a prominent commander, killed in fighting later that year. But these were largely isolated successes against a diffuse, adaptable leadership.
Most got away.
The vast majority of top insurgent leaders remained at large, consistently finding safe sanctuary in the tribal regions of Pakistan right next to Afghanistan.
You got cross-border sanctuary again.
A critical lifeline. Allowed them to escape pursuit, regroup, train, plan attacks with relative impunity. This reality prompted that controversial yet increasingly necessary strategic shift. The U.S. began targeting insurgent leaders in Pakistan with missiles fired from remotely piloted drones.
The drone program.
A covert CIA program, publicly denied by U.S. officials at the time, but widely acknowledged privately. And it had a profound impact on the region and on U.S.-Pakistan relations.
How did Pakistan react officially?
Publicly. They denounced the strikes as violations of their sovereignty, often for domestic political consumption, but privately. Our sources indicate they often approved them, provided civilian casualties were limited. A very complex, contradictory stance.
A tightrope walk for Pakistan.
Trying to maintain a public image of sovereignty while tacitly cooperating on counterterrorism, at least selectively. Our sources also reveal the U.S. repeatedly threatened to expand drone strikes beyond the tribal areas into places like Balochistan if Pakistan didn't show greater cooperation in battling the Taliban. A group, remember, Pakistan had long fostered for its own strategic interest.
A deeply ambiguous relationship.
Ally and perceived enabler. Frustrating for the U.S. This period really highlights that critical strategic dilemma. The enemy, the Taliban, adapted faster, more effectively than international forces. They leveraged local grievances, exploited the opium trade, used cross-border sanctuaries. This persistent external challenge in Pakistan profoundly influenced the war's progression, showed the limits of military power without a comprehensive regional strategy addressing safe havens and ambiguous allegiances.
Which brings us to Phase 3. Roughly 2008 to 2011, marked by the counterinsurgency surge and its many, many challenges. A renewed push to turn the tide, driven by the incoming U.S. President Barack Obama.
Right. Obama came to office promising to refocus attention and resources on what was widely seen as a faltering war in Afghanistan. On February 17, 2009, he quickly approved sending an additional 17,000 U.S. troops, augmenting the existing 36,000 U.S. and 32,000 NATO troops, a clear signal of increased commitment.
And a change in command.
Yes. In May 2009, General David McKiernan, the top U.S. commander, was replaced by General Stanley McChrystal, a change signaling a recognized need for radical change in approach, in execution. McChrystal was brought in specifically to implement a new kind of warfighting.
Counterinsurgency KOIN, like in Iraq.
Exactly. McChrystal was tasked with implementing a new counterinsurgency strategy, deeply modeled after the surge implemented in Iraq, which Petraeus had overseen. This wasn't just about killing insurgents, it was far more comprehensive. The strategy emphasized protecting the population from insurgents, meant embedding troops in communities, providing security. It also sought to persuade enemy fighters to defect through reintegration programs and encourage genuine reconciliation between the Karzai government and maybe more moderate Taliban leaders. Ambitious, multifaceted, required significant resources, time.
But McChrystal felt he didn't have enough troops.
Correct. After assessing the situation, he soon concluded that even with that initial troop increase, he lacked enough forces to effectively implement this complex KOIN strategy across Afghanistan. His confidential report, which controversially leaked in September 2009, starkly predicted the war would be lost without a much more significant troop surge.
A bombshell report.
Huge. After an extensive, intense policy review within the Obama administration, the president announced a major escalation in December 2009, committing to deploy 30,000 additional U.S. troops by the summer of 2010.
The second surge.
A massive gamble, doubling down on a strategy that hadn't yet proven its efficacy in the Afghan context.
And the second surge, while bringing renewed military effort, came with a heavy cost, immediately.
Very heavy. It led to a sharp increase in U.S. combat deaths. Our sources indicate that in early 2010, U.S. fatalities were roughly twice those of the same period in 2009, directly correlating with the increased troop presence, intensified operations.
Yeah.
More troops meant more lives lost.
And the drone war escalated too.
Dramatically. The surge was accompanied by a major escalation of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, still targeting insurgent leadership in those cross-border sanctuaries. One strike successfully killed Pakistani Taliban leader Batullah Masood, a significant blow to that group. However, the CIA, running the drone program, also paid a steep price. December 2009, an al-Qaeda double agent detonated a suicide bomb inside a CIA base in Khost, Afghanistan, tragically killing 7 agency members, highlighted the extreme dangers of operating in that complex intelligence landscape.
Militarily, the surge kicked off with Marja.
Yeah, a significant assault on Marja in Helmand Province early 2010. U.S. Marines, backed by substantial air power, achieved a relatively quick tactical victory, hailed as a test case for the new KOIN strategy.
But politically, things were tense, especially between Obama and Karzai.
Very tense. Obama visited Afghanistan in March 2010, delivered a stern message to Karzai, addressed the pervasive corruption in his government, especially after Karzai's 2009 re-election was tainted by widespread, credible allegations of fraud.
How did Karzai react?
Not well. Feeling immense pressure, maybe resentful of the public criticism, he lashed out in April 2010, made a startling threat to actually join the Taliban if the international community didn't stop meddling in Afghan affairs.
Wow. Join the Taliban.
A public display of defiance from the very leader the U.S. was propping up. Highlighted the deep-seated frustrations, the inherent contradictions, the political volatility of the whole enterprise, showed that even with more troops, the political landscape remained incredibly fragile.
And Pakistan's ambiguous role continued to complicate things, especially peace efforts.
Oh, absolutely. Pakistan, surprisingly, offered to mediate Afghan peace talks, positioning itself as a potential facilitator. But then, this truly controversial event, the arrest of the Afghan Taliban's second-in-command, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, by Pakistani security forces in February 2010, sparked immediate controversy, wildly divergent interpretations.
How so?
Some U.S. officials saw it as genuine cooperation from Pakistan, a sign they were finally willing to crack down. But others, like Kai Eid, the former top UN official in Kabul, strongly believed it was intended to deliberately scuttle political efforts.
Why?
Baradar was widely seen as a key proponent of reconciliation, a pragmatic voice within the Taliban who might have genuinely engaged in peace talks. His removal effectively eliminated a potential pathway to a negotiated settlement. underscoring the enduring complexity, the often contradictory nature of Pakistan's motivations, and its deep influence on the conflict's progression.
And then another high-profile command change. McChrystal out, Petraeus in.
June 2010, yeah. Obama controversially replaced General McChrystal with General David Petraeus, the architect of the Iraq surge. After McChrystal and his staff made disparaging remarks about Obama administration officials, including VP Biden, to a Rolling Stone journalist.
Obama wouldn't tolerate division.
His words, exactly. Sending a clear message about civilian control over the military. Despite the leadership change, Petraeus, the leading Korean architect, was expected to, and largely did, continue McChrystal's emphasis. Population protection, institution building, limiting civilian casualties. Strategic continuity was the intent.
But shortly after Petraeus took over, another bombshell dropped.
The WikiLeaks documents. Shortly after Petraeus took command, WikiLeaks published a massive trove of classified documents, the Afghan War Diary.
What did they reveal?
Our sources confirmed this leak detailed thousands of previously unreported civilian deaths, revealed the existence and operations of a shadowy U.S. Special Forces unit, Task Force 373, specifically targeting insurgent leaders, showed the Taliban using advanced heat-seeking missiles against coalition aircraft, and perhaps most controversially, strongly suggested the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, had been actively collaborating with Taliban forces, even while Pakistan received substantial U.S. aid for counter-militancy.
Did the U.S. confirm this?
The U.S. government, while condemning the leak, largely confirmed the substance of the information, validated the extent of the challenges, the duplicity, the complexities on the ground.
Okay, so unpacking this surge period, a massive strategic gamble, a desperate effort to turn the tide, but constantly accompanied by significant political turbulence, damaging revelations like WikiLeaks, persistent, unresolved cross-border issues, really underscores the incredible, almost intractable complexity. Every step forward seemed met with unforeseen complications or enduring external pressures.
This period truly highlights that profound tension between military strategy, often formulated in Washington, political objectives, constantly shifting, and the deep-seated, often opaque regional dynamics, especially with Pakistan. Pakistan's role, whether unreliable ally or active enabler, continued to complicate every single effort, fundamentally influenced the war's progression in profound ways, made a decisive victory incredibly difficult to achieve.
Despite all these challenges, there were some key milestones that marked significant shifts. Osama bin Laden.
Finally, the man whose actions directly triggered the war. Killed by U.S. Navy SEALs, May 2, 2011, in that daring raid on his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan.
Nearly 10 years after Tora Bora.
Nearly 10 years after he slipped away. This singular event was a major victory in the stated war on terror, fulfilled one of the primary objectives laid out right at the beginning.
And did that change the dynamic, open doors?
It seemed to. Potentially, it marked a significant, almost symbolic achievement against a primary objective. And with bin Laden dead, maybe a perception the al-Qaeda threat was degraded, a new avenue seemed to open. In June 2011, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates publicly confirmed preliminary reconciliation talks were underway with the Taliban, indicating a potential shift towards exploring a political solution, a recognition that a purely military approach might not be enough.
But the path to withdrawal was already being charted.
Yes. On June 2011, President Obama formally announced an accelerated timetable for U.S. troop withdrawal. He cited that the U.S. had largely achieved its core goals, disrupting al-Qaeda, killing its leadership, suggesting the primary justification for the large-scale military presence was receding.
What was the plan?
Reduce as many as 30,000 U.S. troops within a year. Prepare for a complete combat withdrawal by the end of 2014. France quickly followed suit, announcing withdrawal of its 4,000 soldiers, set a clear public end date for the combat mission, shifted the focus to transition, Afghan self-sufficiency.
But these peace talks, reconciliation efforts, they were fragile.
Extremely fragile. They suffered a major tragic setback in September 2011, the assassination of Burhanuddin Rabbani, former Afghan president, key negotiator for peace.
What did his death signify?
It underscored the enduring difficulty of achieving a lasting political settlement, highlighted the deep divisions, the persistent violent opposition to any form of reconciliation with the existing government, a stark reminder that peace was still a distant, perilous prospect.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly now, within what we've been calling Phase 3, and dive deeper into the winding road of internal and external challenges. These things consistently undermined efforts, shaped the conflict's progression. First, looking inside Afghanistan itself. Governance, corruption, public sentiment. Karzai's leadership, as we've noted, a persistent challenge.
Indeed, a fundamental challenge. Despite vast constitutional powers, Karzai was increasingly perceived as weak, isolated, his government consistently beset by rampant endemic corruption, alienated the population, diverted critical resources, and those security concerns kept him largely confined to the presidential palace in Kabul, limited his ability to govern effectively, connect with the populace, efforts to build that national army and police force. Troubled from the start. Inadequate international support, poor training, significant ethnic differences made them less effective, prone to internal divisions. And his 2009 re-election, tainted by those widespread fraud allegations, further undermined his legitimacy, public trust, an unstable foundation for the whole international mission.
And critically, trust was rapidly eroding between international forces and the Afghan populace. A series of deeply damaging incidents in early 2012 really heightened tensions, provoked widespread outrage.
Oh, those were critical incidents.
Yeah.
Ignited profound public anger. Mid-January 2012, that horrifying video circulated showing U.S. Marines urinating on dead Afghans, an act of profound disrespect, resonated deeply.
Then the Quran burning.
Weeks later, Afghans rioted, protested across the country. Reports of U.S. soldiers inadvertently or carelessly burning copies of the Quran, perceived as sacrilege.
And the Panjwai shooting.
Most tragically, March 11, 2012, a U.S. soldier allegedly went on a shooting rampage, killed 17 Afghans, mostly defenseless women and children near Panjwai. These horrific events fueled an already simmering resentment.
Absolutely catastrophic for public opinion, the mission. Provoked widespread demonstrations, often violent. Drew sharp condemnations from Karzai, who used them to assert Afghan sovereignty. And the Taliban. They immediately seized on the outrage, publicly suspended their participation in those nascent talks with the U.S. and Afghan government.
A profound setback for any hope of a political resolution, drove a wedge deeper between international forces and the very people they sought to help.
And complicating things further were the green-on-blue attacks.
Deeply troubling. NATO's efforts to train, equip the Afghan army and police were increasingly hampered by an alarming increase in these insider attacks. Afghan soldiers, police supposed allies turning their weapons on NATO soldiers, trainers.
What was the impact?
Forced profound changes. NATO troops had to institute more rigorous screening procedures for recruits. In some cases, suspend training of certain units altogether. Directly impacted the readiness, reliability of the Afghan forces meant to take over. How could you trust them?
And ongoing issues of sovereignty, detentions, night raids.
Persistent sources of friction, resentment, threatened the very basis of the partnership.
Yeah.
In early 2012, U.S. and Afghan negotiators finally reached agreements on these two key issues.
What were the agreements?
First, in March, a clear 6-month timetable for transferring Afghan detainees from U.S. to Afghan custody, a long-standing demand by Kabul. Second, reached in April, established that Afghan forces would now oversee and lead night raids.
Those raids were controversial.
Hugely. A major component of the campaign since 2009, seen by the U.S. as highly effective against insurgents. But Afghan leaders had long objected. Violations of sovereignty, alienating public opinion, inadvertently increasing support for the insurgency through resentment. These agreements, though significant, came after years of friction mounting public anger, highlighted that persistent disconnect between international military tactics and local cultural sensitivities.
So this period really underscores the internal challenges.
Critically, a weak, corrupt government struggling for legitimacy, a populace increasingly alienated by casualties, perceived disrespect, sovereignty violations, and a national army struggling with internal divisions, insider threats. These elements profoundly influenced the war's progression, undermined international efforts, made a successful transition seem increasingly tenuous.
Now let's turn to the regional ripple effect. Pakistan's incredibly complex, often contradictory role. Our sources repeatedly highlight Pakistan's territory as an indispensable sanctuary for insurgents, a constant external challenge.
Absolutely. The problem of cross-border sanctuary was fundamental, a critical lifeline for the insurgency, allowed them to escape pursuit, regroup, train, plan attacks with relative impunity. Al-Qaeda, after Tora Bora, demonstrably reestablished its base in the tribal areas of Pakistan's northwest border. And critically, Mullah Omar and his top Taliban lieutenants didn't disappear. They settled in and around Quetta in Balochistan, operating from what was effectively a safe haven, coordinating the insurgency from within a supposedly allied nation.
And this sanctuary directly led to the U.S. using drone strikes in Pakistan, which, again, brought up sovereignty issues, strained relations.
Right. The U.S. began actively targeting insurgent leaders in Pakistan with missiles from those drones, the covert CIA program. generated significant controversy.
And Pakistan's stance remained complex.
Publicly denounced the strikes, violations of sovereignty, causes civilian casualties. Privately, often tacitly approved, provided casualties were limited, targets were high value, that dual stance, that tightrope. The U.S., frustrated, repeatedly threatened to expand drone strikes if Pakistan didn't show greater cooperation against the Taliban. A group, remember, Pakistan had long fostered for strategic depth, deeply ambiguous, ally and perceived enabler.
This is where it gets so intricate, so frustrating. Pakistan operating in this contradictory space, the implications for the war's progression, its outcome, huge.
It raises that profoundly important question. How much did the sanctuary, the training, the alleged support from across the border, particularly from elements within Pakistan's intelligence, contribute to the insurgency's extraordinary resilience? And how did that directly impact the effectiveness of U.S. international strategies? The WikiLeaks diary suggested ISI collaboration. The Berdar arrest seemed to some like sabotage of peace talks. This complex relationship was a continuous, almost insurmountable external challenge.
Okay, finally, let's broaden our view to the international dynamics. Divergent priorities that profoundly influenced the war, often to its detriment. The shadow of Iraq looms large.
Undeniable.
Yeah.
From 2002 onwards, Iraq profoundly diverted U.S. attention, critical resources away from Afghanistan. As we've said, development efforts were inadequately funded, aid programs plagued by waste, confusion. This strategic pivot left Afghanistan in a critical resource deficit precisely when it needed maximum investment in stability, nation building.
And it impacted military strategy, too. ISAF caveats, the light footprint.
Directly. The Pentagon insisted on limiting ISAF beyond Kabul, fearing Afghanistan would be a drag on U.S. resources needed for Iraq, led to ISAF being hampered by caveats, lack of troops as international commitments flagged. By late 2006, as Iraq's sectarian war escalated, U.S. officials explicitly said the U.S. would play a lesser role in Afghanistan. Clear shift in priorities, commitment.
So the bigger picture shows competing priorities undermining Afghanistan efforts.
Vividly. You see how the why of the war shifted, how competing priorities Iraq, declining Western public support, rising casualties directly impacted resources, strategies deployed in Afghanistan, often to its profound detriment, influenced the war's progression, prolonged it, arguably undermined its overall effectiveness, demonstrates that complex interplay of international relations, domestic politics on ground realities.
And even internally within the U.S. government, significant tensions, McChrystal's dismissal in 2010.
Right. After those disparaging remarks about administration officials, underscored festering tensions between military commanders in Afghanistan and civilian leadership in Washington. Obama's "won't tolerate division" statement signaled a need for unified command, strategic alignment.
So even at the highest levels, disagreements.
Competing visions, frustrations, ideological differences over the approach. These internal U.S. tensions inevitably rippled down, influenced the overall conduct, progression of the war, added another layer of complexity to an already incredibly challenging environment, shows even allies, even within one's own government, shared objectives can be undermined by internal disagreements.
So after all these shifts, challenges, over a decade of intense conflict, what were the long-term consequences, the lasting impacts, particularly up to 2014? Let's start with the human and financial cost. It's immense.
The numbers are sobering, almost overwhelming. By the formal end of the combat mission, December 2014, American military casualties included some 2,400 service members killed, approximately 20,700 others wounded, many with life-altering injuries. And the toll extended far beyond U.S. forces. British troops suffered around 300 deaths, Canadians some 150, more than 20 other countries lost troops too. International sacrifice.
But those are just international forces. Afghan civilian casualties remained tragically high throughout.
Stubbornly, tragically high, directly linked to both those new, lethal Taliban tactics, IEDs, suicide bombings, and, unfortunately, to U.S., NATO operations like airstrikes, night raids, despite efforts to mitigate harm. And the surge itself, while militarily robust, led to that increase in U.S. combat deaths in early 2010. Intensified activity meant increased human cost for everyone involved.
It's so easy to get lost in strategy talk, politics. We have to remember the human toll. These aren't just statistics. Hundreds of thousands of lives profoundly altered, families shattered, a nation scarred, the ultimate price of war.
And the financial investment. Massive, yet often fundamentally inadequate for the scale of the challenge. Just over $38 billion in humanitarian reconstruction assistance appropriated by the U.S. Congress between 2001 and 2009 sounds vast, but over half went just to training Afghan security forces, leaving a fraction for genuine economic social development.
Not enough for real rebuilding.
Experts consistently said it was woefully insufficient. To rebuild a country consistently near the bottom of global human development indices, plagued by illiteracy, poverty, lack of infrastructure, highlights the significant but ultimately insufficient financial commitment relative to the ambitious goals.
Beyond the direct costs, the enduring political, social fallout, leaving Afghanistan in this unstable equilibrium. By December 2014, it was the longest war ever fought by the United States. 13 years. Staggering.
And despite that immense investment time, resources, human life, the fundamental governance challenges persisted. Tragically, Karzai's government remained deeply beset by corruption, eating away at legitimacy, effectiveness. Efforts to build effective independent national army, police forces, troubled throughout, never quite reaching the level of self-sufficiency required. And that powerful central government structure from the 2004 Constitution, fundamentally opposed to Afghanistan's traditions of decentralized power, local authority, created persistent internal challenge for stable governance.
And the insurgency never really went away. Adapted, persisted. The Taliban resurged, adopted those more lethal tactics, ensured a constant brutal cycle of violence, prevented normalcy. And the opium industry came back with a vengeance post-2001. Became a powerful, self-sustaining funding mechanism for the insurgency. Afghanistan supplying over 90% of the world's opium. Vast, untraceable revenues to the very forces the international community was fighting.
Which raises that profoundly important question. To what extent did these internal governance issues, corruption, structural flaws, weak security forces, combined with the erosion of local trust, fundamentally undermine the ambitious nation-building goals, regardless of external military strategies? The erosion of public support, sentiment among Afghans was a significant lasting consequence, directly impacted the war's progression, its ultimate outcome. Anti-American, anti-Western feelings grew. Slow reconstruction, prisoner abuse, government corruption, civilian casualties, incidents like the Koran burning, the Panjwai shooting, provoked widespread outrage, directly impacted reconciliation talks, pushed the Taliban away, further isolated international forces.
Which brings us to the most unsettling long-term consequence, the enduring nature of the conflict itself. Despite killing bin Laden, al-Qaeda reestablished itself in Pakistan, maintained operational capability, and the Taliban leadership, Omar and his lieutenants, found consistent sanctuary support in Pakistan, allowed them to rebuild, sustain their insurgency.
Demonstrated the deeply enduring nature of the threat, the profound difficulty of eradicating it without decisively addressing those regional sanctuaries, a critical external challenge, fundamentally unresolved throughout. The resilience of these non-state actors, their ability to adapt, persist with external support. One of the most significant, frustrating lessons.
And critically, by the end of the combat mission in December 2014, were the Afghan forces ready? Our sources say many units appeared ill-prepared to hold off the Taliban.
Yeah, the source states definitively, a sobering assessment. The new approach largely failed to achieve its aims. Insurgent attacks and civilian casualties remained stubbornly high, a key long-term consequence, indicating that despite immense investment, sacrifice, the fundamental security situation remained precarious.
So synthesizing all this, what does it truly mean? Massive investment, lives, treasure, strategic focus, tragic casualties. Yet the fundamental challenges, the insurgency, governance issues, corruption, regional complexities largely persisted, profoundly influenced the war's progression, its ultimate unsettling outcome.
It really points to the resilience of non-state actors operating within complex regional dynamics, and perhaps the inherent limitations of conventional military interventions in deeply entrenched historical cultural contexts. The enduring nature of the conflict, despite varied strategies, immense resources, underscores the profound difficulty of imposing external solutions without fully addressing indigenous political, social, economic realities.
Which finally brings us to the ultimate conclusion of this particular chapter. The sunset, how did it end? The road to formal withdrawal began with that clear public announcement by President Obama, June 22, 2011, setting a timetable.
Yes, Obama announced the U.S. had largely achieved its primary goals, disrupting al-Qaeda, killing its leadership. The plan, substantial troop reduction, 30,000 within a year, preparing for complete combat withdrawal by end of 2014, sent a clear message the large-scale combat mission was finite. France swiftly announced its withdrawal too, signaled a broader international shift toward disengagement from direct combat. Set the countdown.
And in 2012, that concerted diplomatic effort to resolve friction points, aiming for a smoother transition, those two significant agreements addressing grievances.
Right. Detainee transfer and night raid oversight, March 2012. 6-month timetable set for transferring Afghan detainees from U.S. to Afghan custody. Major step for sovereignty. April 2012. agreement that Afghan forces would now oversee and lead all-night raids, directly addressed Afghan concerns about sovereignty, public opinion on that controversial tactic.
And these agreements paved the way for
Her broader May 2012 agreement outlined a comprehensive framework for economic security cooperation post-2014, committed the U.S. to continued military support training, assistance, but crucially left the question of a remaining force of trainers advisors to a separate, highly anticipated bilateral security agreement, the BSA. This period shows a deliberate effort to manage the exit, address key contentions for a smoother transition. Yet the underlying fragility was always present. Despite unpopularity of foreign troops, many Afghans feared a sudden, complete withdrawal could lead to renewed civil war, chaos, stark reflection of the country's deep instability.
So the final act of this combat mission, its formal ending in 2014, the BSA itself became a critical point of contention, almost derailed everything.
It really did. Our sources tell us the issue of leaving any foreign troops post-2014 remained deeply unresolved until late that year, largely because President Karzai, in his final months, stubbornly refused to sign the agreement, despite immense international pressure, seemed determined to exert his final act of sovereignty even at the cost of future stability.
An incredibly tense period, diplomatic limbo.
Until the election recount. Following that lengthy, contentious recount after the 2014 presidential election, Ashraf Ghani was inaugurated as president in late September 2014, one of his very first acts. Immediately upon taking office, signed the BSA, finally resolved that critical piece, ensured a continued, albeit reduced, international military presence to support Afghan forces. Decisive action allowed the transition framework to proceed.
And with that, the U.S. and NATO formally ended their combat mission in Afghanistan, December 28, 2014. Official conclusion of this 13-year chapter of direct military engagement. But the story didn't completely end there. A reduced force remained.
13,000 troops remained, yeah. Their role explicitly shifted. No longer combat. Support and train Afghan troops. Until a further drawdown initiated in 2020. An attempt to ensure stability, capability. A bridge to a self-reliant Afghan future.
Which brings us to the unsettling ultimate outcome, explicitly stated in our source material. A full withdrawal of U.S. troops initiated in 2020, accelerated, continued into 2021, and the source concludes definitively. A stark, almost poetic statement, bringing the whole narrative full circle. The resurgence of the Taliban during the withdrawal left the country in similar straits to when U.S. forces had arrived 20 years earlier. That's a powerful, sobering, almost unbelievable conclusion, isn't it? Despite immense investment, tragic sacrifice, strategy shifts, 2 decades of international involvement, the narrative ultimately comes full circle. Back to the initial conditions that triggered the intervention, forces you to ask deep questions about the efficacy of these prolonged engagements.
What's truly striking here is the stark finality of that statement. Immense investment, profound sacrifice, decades of international effort. And the outcome, as described in the source, appears to be a return to the very challenges that triggered the initial intervention. It raises an important question, I think, for all of us to consider. When a conflict of this magnitude, spanning decades, consuming vast resources, ultimately concludes by returning essentially to its starting point, what fundamental lessons does that teach us? About the limits of military intervention, the enduring resilience of non-state actors, or perhaps the paramount importance of truly understanding, respecting the deep historical, cultural, political context of a region before embarking on such ambitious undertakings.
Powerful and incredibly complex questions indeed. You've now taken a comprehensive deep dive into one of the most complex and protracted conflicts of our time. You've gained an understanding not just of the events, but the interconnected challenges, the shifting priorities, the profound human cost that shaped its course from its origins, through its evolution, and to its ultimate conclusion as detailed in our sources. We encourage you to continue your own exploration of these vital themes and perhaps to grapple with those questions we've just posed. Thank you for diving deep with us.